Cade Van Toren froze at the top of the stone steps, his hand tightening on the carved railing until his knuckles turned pale. Something was wrong. He had walked into this hall 1,000 times, and every single time, the moment he crossed the threshold, the minds of every wolf inside opened to him like pages of a book. Tonight, for the first time in his entire life, one page stayed shut. The great hall of Van Toren Castle glittered with candlelight and silver dishes, the coronation feast for his sister Elira roaring around him with music and laughter. Cade forced his shoulders back and walked down the steps as if nothing had happened, greeting nobles with practiced nods, letting their private thoughts wash over him the way they always did. A lord admired his own reflection in a wine goblet. A lady worried her gown was too plain. A young guard silently rehearsed the words he planned to say to a girl across the room. All of it came to Cade the way sound comes to anyone with working ears. He didn't ask for it, it simply arrived. Then his eyes landed on her. She stood near the kitchen doorway in a plain gray dress, a tray balanced on one hand, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. She wasn't a noble. She wasn't anyone he recognized. And when Cade's attention settled on her, expecting the familiar hum of thought to greet him, there was nothing. Not silence in the way a quiet mind felt silent. This was different. This was absence, like reaching for a stair that wasn't there and finding only air. He blinked and tried again, sharpening his focus the way his old teacher had shown him decades ago. Nothing. Not a flicker, not a whisper, not even the formless static of a distracted mind. It was as if she did not exist to his gift at all, even though she stood no more than 30 paces away. Very much alive, very much real. My lord? Rel, his guard captain, appeared at his elbow, following his stare. You look like you've seen a ghost. Who is that? Cade asked, keeping his voice low and even. Rel followed his gaze to the servant girl, who had turned now to speak with an older woman near the kitchen doors. One of the new kitchen staff. Came up from the southern villages a few months back. Why? Cade didn't answer right away. He watched her set down the tray and laugh at something the older woman said, her whole face changing with the laugh, bright and unguarded. If she was hiding something, she was doing a remarkable job of looking like she wasn't hiding anything at all. No reason, Cade said finally. Tell me her name. I'll find out. Rel studied him a moment longer, clearly sensing this was not idle curiosity, then melted back into the crowd toward the kitchen staff. Cade forced himself to move through the rest of the feast, but his attention kept drifting back to her, testing his gift again and again like a tongue returning to a broken tooth. Every other wolf in the hall opened to him without effort. Only she remained closed. It should not have been possible. His gift, passed down through generations of Van Toren alphas, had never failed him, not once, not even against wolves who trained their entire lives to guard their thoughts. Skilled liars still leaked something at the edges, a flicker of guilt, a spike of fear. This girl gave him nothing at all, and that unsettling nothing was louder to him than any confession could have been. He told himself it was exhaustion. The coronation preparations had kept him awake for 3 nights running, negotiating with border lords, reviewing security for the ceremony, settling a dispute between 2 hunting parties that had nearly come to blows over territory lines. A tired mind could misfire, a tired gift could stumble. That was the only explanation that made any sense, and so he clung to it as the musicians began a new song, and his sister took the floor to dance with the captain of her own guard. Elira caught his eye from across the room and gave him a small, private smile, the kind that only siblings share, the kind that said she knew he'd rather be anywhere else than at a party. He returned it, letting himself relax for one breath, one heartbeat, before his gaze slid back toward the kitchen doorway. The servant girl was gone. Cade's pulse ticked up, an irrational stab of alarm he didn't fully understand. He scanned the hall, searching through the crowd of moving bodies and swirling gowns, and found no trace of gray fabric or dark braided hair. He told himself it didn't matter. She was a servant. She had likely gone to fetch more wine or clear a table in the side chamber. There was no reason for the alpha king of the Van Toren pack to care where a kitchen girl had wandered off to during his sister's coronation feast. And yet he found himself walking toward the kitchen corridor anyway, murmuring an excuse to the nearest noble about checking on the wine stores, a lie so thin he half expected someone to call him on it. No one did. No one questioned the king's movements, not even when those movements made no sense. The corridor beyond the hall was cooler, lit by fewer candles, the noise of the feast fading into a low murmur behind him. He heard the clatter of dishes ahead and followed the sound to a narrow pantry room where the girl stood alone, stacking empty trays against the wall, her back to him. "You're not where the other staff are," Cade said before he could stop himself. She spun around, startled, and for one unguarded second, her expression was pure surprise, wide eyes and parted lips, before she caught herself and dropped into a hurried bow. "My Lord King." "Forgive me, I didn't hear you come in." "You're forgiven," he said, and reached for her thoughts again, deliberately this time, at close range, with nothing between them but a few feet of pantry air. Still nothing, not even the ordinary nervous flutter he would have expected from a servant unexpectedly alone with her king. It was as if his gift simply stopped working the moment it touched her, like water hitting stone instead of soaking into soil. "Is something wrong, my lord?" she asked, straightening slowly, her dark eyes searching his face with a wariness that seemed older than her years. "What's your name?" "Wren, my lord. Wren Calloway." "How long have you served in this castle, Wren Calloway?" 4 months, my lord." She hesitated. "Have I done something wrong?" Cade studied her, searching her face for any sign of deception, any twitch or flicker that might explain the strange emptiness where her thoughts should have been. He found nothing there either, just a young woman standing very still, clearly uncertain why the king of the realm had followed her into a pantry to ask her name. "No," he said finally, "you've done nothing wrong. Return to your duties." She bowed again, and slipped past him into the corridor, careful not to brush against him, and Cade stood alone, among the stacked trays for a long moment, turning the impossible fact over in his mind. Every wolf in his kingdom, from the newest pup to the oldest elder, carried thoughts he could hear the instant he chose to listen. It was the gift that had kept his father's rule secure for 30 years, and his own rule secure for the 5 years since. It was the reason no assassin had ever gotten close enough to strike, the reason no traitor had ever plotted for long before Cade caught the shape of betrayal forming in their mind. It was, in many ways, the only thing standing between his pack and the chaos that had swallowed lesser kingdoms before. And now, for reasons he could not begin to explain, it had failed him completely in the presence of one servant girl, with tired eyes and careful hands. He walked back toward the hall slowly, letting the noise and light swallow him again, and told himself that whatever this was, he would understand it soon enough. He always did. That was the quiet confidence that had carried him through every crisis of his young reign, the certainty that his gift would show him the truth eventually, that nothing stayed hidden from him for long. But even as he rejoined the feast and smiled through the rest of the evening, some small, stubborn part of him kept circling back to that pantry room, to the flash of surprise on her face before she composed herself, to the strange and total silence where her mind should have been. It felt less like a mystery to be solved, and more like the first crack in a wall he had never known was there, a wall that had, until tonight, kept something enormous and unseen, safely on the other side. Later that night, long after the musicians had packed away their instruments and the last of the guests had staggered off to their beds, Cade stood alone at the window of his private chamber, looking out over the sleeping castle grounds. Somewhere below, in the servants' quarters near the kitchens, Wren Calloway was likely asleep as well, unaware that the king of the Van Toren pack had spent the better part of an hour trying and failing to hear a single thought pass through her mind. He should have let it go. A wise ruler did not chase shadows, especially not shadows wearing the shape of an ordinary servant girl. But as he finally climbed into bed and closed his eyes, he found himself replaying the moment their eyes had met in that narrow pantry, and the strange, unfamiliar sensation that had followed. It wasn't fear, exactly. It wasn't quite curiosity either, though there was plenty of that too. It was something closer to recognition, as if some deep, instinctive part of him understood that his ordered, predictable world had just tilted slightly on its axis, and would never sit quite level again. Rel found him at breakfast the next morning, sliding into the seat across from him with the particular expression he wore when he had information he wasn't sure the king wanted to hear. "You asked about the girl," Rel said, keeping his voice low despite the empty dining hall. "Wren Calloway, 19 years old. Came from a border village to the south, orphaned young, no living family that the records show. Quiet, keeps to herself, well liked by the other staff. Nothing unusual. Nothing unusual, Cade repeated, turning the words over as if they tasted wrong. Should there be? Rel asked, watching him carefully. Cade thought of the silence in her mind, the absence where thought should have lived, and chose his next words with care. Keep watching her. Quietly. I want to know everything about her, starting from before she ever set foot in this castle. Rel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't ask why. He had served the Van Toren throne long enough to know that when the king's instincts sharpened like this, there was usually a reason, even if that reason wasn't clear yet. I'll see to it, he said, and rose from the table, leaving Cade alone with his half-finished meal, and a growing certainty that whatever Wren Calloway was hiding, it was going to change everything. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over Van Toren Castle, gilding the stone walls in gold, and somewhere within those walls, a servant girl went about her ordinary duties, completely unaware that the most powerful wolf in the kingdom had just decided she was the most important mystery of his life. 3 days after the coronation feast, Cade summoned Wren Calloway to his study, under the pretense of reviewing kitchen supplies for an upcoming trade delegation. It was a flimsy excuse, and he knew it the moment he said it aloud to his steward, but no one questioned the king's requests, however strange they seemed. Wren arrived exactly on time, dressed in the same plain gray uniform the kitchen staff wore, her hair braided back neatly, her hands clasped in front of her in the careful posture of someone trained to disappear into the background of a room. Cade gestured for her to sit across from him at the long table, and she did, though her spine stayed straight and her eyes stayed watchful, tracking his every movement the way a person tracks a predator they aren't sure has noticed them yet. The delegation arrives in 2 weeks, Cade said, sliding a scroll of supply lists across the table toward her, though he had no real interest in its contents. I'm told you've become quite skilled in the kitchens. I want your opinion on whether we have enough stores for the extra guests. Wren studied the scroll with a furrowed brow, clearly taking the task seriously despite its obvious strangeness. We would need more grain, my lord, and likely more preserved meat if the delegation stays more than a week. I can speak with the head cook and have proper numbers for you by tomorrow. That would be helpful, Cade said, though he wasn't listening to her words nearly as closely as he was listening for the thoughts beneath them. He reached, the way he always reached, expecting the familiar door to open and reveal whatever she was truly thinking, behind her calm, dutiful expression. Nothing. Just that same impossible silence, as complete and unbroken as it had been in the pantry 3 nights ago. Is there something else, my lord? Wren asked, noticing his prolonged stare. She didn't flinch under it the way most servants would have. Instead, there was a flicker of something sharper in her eyes, something that looked almost like suspicion. No, Cade said, forcing himself to sound casual. You may go. Bring me the numbers tomorrow. She rose, bowed, and left without another word, and Cade sat alone in his study for a long while afterward, staring at the closed door, more unsettled than he had been 3 days ago. He had hoped proximity would change something, that perhaps his gift had simply needed a second, closer attempt to find its footing. Instead, he had confirmed the impossible all over again. Whatever kept Wren Calloway's mind hidden from him wasn't a fluke or a trick of exhaustion. It was constant, deliberate, and utterly without explanation. That evening, Rel returned with more information, though it did little to ease Cade's growing unease. I spoke with the village elder from where she was raised, Rel reported, standing at ease in front of Cade's desk. Wren Calloway was orphaned as an infant, left at the doorstep of the local healer during a hard winter. No one ever came forward claiming to know her parents. She grew up under the healer's care until she passed 2 years ago, and Wren came to the capital looking for work shortly after. An orphan with no family, no ties, no history beyond a doorstep and a dead healer, Cade said slowly. That's either a very unlucky life or a very convenient one. You think she's lying? Rel asked. I think someone went through a great deal of effort to make her story unremarkable, Cade said. And I don't believe in coincidences, especially not ones that happen to walk into my castle and vanish from my gift entirely. Rel was quiet for a moment, weighing his next words carefully. My lord, if I may ask directly, do you believe she poses a threat to you? Cade considered the question honestly, turning it over the way he turned over every serious question that crossed his desk. He thought of the surprise on her face in the pantry, unguarded and entirely human. He thought of the careful, competent way she'd answered his questions about the supply stores, clearly wanting to do her small task well even though it meant nothing to her. Nothing about her behavior suggested malice, and yet the silence in her mind sat like a stone in his chest, impossible to ignore. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "That's what troubles me most. I've never not known before." He ordered Rel to continue watching her, subtly, without drawing attention, and to report anything unusual, however small. Rel agreed and left, and Cade spent the rest of the evening alone with his thoughts, pacing the length of his study until the candles burned low. Over the following week, Cade found excuses to be near Ren more often than any reasonable king should have needed to be near a kitchen servant. He reviewed supply reports she had prepared. He questioned staff assignments during castle events where she happened to be present. He told himself each time that it was simple due diligence, the natural caution of a ruler investigating an anomaly in his kingdom's security. He was not entirely successful in believing his own excuses. What he noticed, in these small and scattered encounters, was that Ren carried herself differently than the other servants. She was polite and diligent, never rude, never careless in her duties. But there was a watchfulness in her that the others lacked, a habit of positioning herself near exits, of tracking who entered and left a room before she settled her attention on any task. It was the behavior of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that safety was never guaranteed and always worth planning for. He also noticed, with a discomfort he didn't examine too closely, that she made him work harder for information than anyone else in his castle. Every other wolf gave themselves away eventually. In a stray thought or an unguarded moment his gift caught without effort. Ren gave nothing away, because there was nothing for his gift to catch, and so he found himself relying on the same tools an ordinary person would use, watching her expressions, listening to her words, drawing conclusions from behavior alone. It was, he realized with some surprise, an entirely unfamiliar way of understanding another person, and stranger still, he found he didn't dislike it. The turning point came during a minor kitchen fire that broke out in the castle's lower level, sparked by an overturned oil lamp near the pantry stores. Cade heard the commotion from his study, and arrived just as the staff were forming a bucket line, smoke curling out from beneath the pantry door. In the chaos, he saw Ren dart past two larger, stronger servants to grab the heaviest water bucket herself, hauling it toward the flames without a moment's hesitation, her jaw set with fierce concentration. The fire was extinguished within minutes, more frightening than truly dangerous, but in the aftermath, as the staff caught their breath and the head cook tallied the damage, Cade found himself watching Ren wipe soot from her hands with a torn apron, her movements steady, despite what had clearly been a frightening ordeal. "That was brave," he said, approaching her before he'd fully decided to. She looked up, startled again by his sudden presence, though this time the surprise faded quickly into something more guarded. "It needed doing, my lord. I didn't think about it much beyond that." "Most people freeze in moments like that," he said. "I've never had the luxury of freezing," she replied, and then seemed to catch herself, as if she'd said more than she intended. She looked away, busying her hands with the ruined apron, and Cade felt that same prickle of recognition he'd felt in the pantry 3 nights ago, the sense that there was a much larger story beneath her calm, careful surface, one she had spent a very long time learning to keep hidden. "What does that mean?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle, aware that pressing too hard might close whatever small door had just cracked open. Ren hesitated, glancing at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between wariness and exhaustion. "It means I learned young that no one else was going to save me if I didn't move fast enough myself," she said finally. "That's all, my lord, nothing more interesting than that." She excused herself before he could ask anything further, disappearing back into the recovering chaos of the kitchen, and Cade stood alone in the smoke-hazed corridor, replaying her words long after she'd gone. No one else was going to save me. It wasn't the sentence of someone who had simply grown up poor or unlucky. It was the sentence of someone who had survived something that had taught her, early and permanently, that the world was not a safe place, and that she alone was responsible for staying alive in it. That night, Cade sat awake far longer than he should have, staring at the ceiling of his chamber, turning over every fragment he had gathered so far. A girl with no family history that could be verified. A girl whose thoughts were entirely closed to the one gift that had never failed him before. A girl who moved through danger like someone who had faced far worse than a kitchen fire, and who let slip, in an unguarded moment, that survival had been a lonely and difficult lesson learned far too early in life. He was no closer to understanding what Wren Calloway truly was. But for the first time since the coronation feast, the mystery of her no longer felt like a threat to be neutralized. It felt like a door he desperately wanted to open, one careful, patient step at a time, even if he couldn't yet explain to himself why he wanted that so badly, or why the thought of frightening her away had begun to bother him nearly as much as the thought of never learning her secret at all. The festival of the Long Harvest arrived 2 weeks later, filling the castle grounds with color and noise, banners strung between the towers, and market stalls crowding the outer courtyard. It was tradition for the Alpha King to select a personal attendant for the 3 days of celebration, someone to manage his schedule, fetch what he needed, and stand beside him through the long ceremonies. In every year of his reign, Cade had chosen from among his trusted guards or senior staff. This year, to the visible surprise of his entire household, he chose Wren Calloway. "You want a kitchen servant as your attendant," his steward repeated carefully, as though Cade might have misspoken. "I want someone capable and unafraid of hard work," Cade said. "She's proven both." The steward didn't argue further, though Cade caught the look Rel gave him from across the room, a look that said clearly enough that his guard captain understood exactly what was happening, and wasn't fooled for a moment by the official explanation. Cade ignored it. He told himself this was still investigation, still due diligence, a way to keep Wren close enough to observe without the awkwardness of following her through her kitchen duties day after day. It was a reasonable explanation. It simply wasn't the whole truth, and some quiet, honest part of him knew that. Wren herself seemed baffled by the appointment when Rel informed her of it, though she accepted with the same careful composure she brought to everything. On the first morning of the festival, she arrived at Cade's chambers precisely on time, dressed in a slightly finer version of her usual uniform, her hair braided with a single blue ribbon that marked her temporary status as the king's attendant. "I don't know the first thing about managing a king's schedule," she admitted as they walked together toward the courtyard, where the opening ceremony was already gathering a crowd. "Neither did the last 3 attendants I chose," Cade said. "You'll learn quickly. Most people do when they have no other choice." She glanced sideways at him, and he caught, for just a moment, the ghost of a smile before she smoothed it away. "Is that meant to be encouraging, my lord?" "It's meant to be honest," he said. "I find people respond better to honesty than to false comfort." "That's a rare quality in a king," Wren said, and there was something in her tone, some dry amusement layered beneath the polite words, that made Cade laugh before he could stop himself. A real laugh, startled out of him, in a way that hadn't happened in longer than he cared to admit. The 3 days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Wren proved sharp and efficient, anticipating problems before they became visible, smoothing over minor conflicts between vendors and guests, with a calm diplomacy that surprised even the seasoned members of his court. She managed his schedule with quiet competence, reminding him of appointments he'd forgotten, redirecting overly persistent nobles with graceful excuses, and standing at his side through the long, formal ceremonies without ever seeming bored or restless the way past attendants had. More than her competence, though, it was her presence itself that Cade found himself drawn to. She wasn't intimidated by him the way nearly everyone else in his life was. Most wolves in his court, even the powerful ones, carried a certain wariness around him, a caution born of knowing he could hear their unspoken thoughts at any moment. It made conversations with him stilted, careful, performances rather than genuine exchanges. Wren, having no idea her mind was the one exception to his gift, treated him like an ordinary person. She argued with him about the seating arrangement for the harvest banquet. She teased him, gently but unmistakably, when he complained about the length of a merchant guild's opening speech. She corrected him once, in front of 2 visiting lords, when he misremembered the name of a trade route, and did it so smoothly that neither lord seemed to notice the correction had even happened. "You're not afraid of me," Cade observed on the second evening, as they walked the torchlit path back toward the castle, after the day's ceremonies had finally ended. "Should I be?" Wren asked, genuinely curious rather than nervous. "Most people are." "Most people probably have reasons I don't know about," she said thoughtfully. "You've been fair with me. Firm but fair. I don't see much reason to be afraid of someone who treats me decently. Cade considered that, turning the simple logic of it over in his mind. It was such an ordinary way to judge a person, based entirely on how they behaved, rather than on rumors of hidden power or inherited authority. He realized, with something like relief, that it had been a very long time since anyone had judged him that plainly, without the weight of his gift and his crown pressing down on every interaction. "What would make you afraid of someone?" he asked, genuinely curious now. Something shifted in her expression, subtle but real, a flicker of old caution surfacing before she smoothed it away again. "Someone who wanted to control me," she said carefully. "Someone who couldn't accept that I might think or choose differently than they wanted. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime." "That sounds like a specific memory, not a general fear," Cade said, watching her closely. "It's not something I discuss, my lord," Wren said, her voice gentle but final, closing the subject as neatly as shutting a door. Cade let it go, sensing the boundary she'd drawn and respecting it, though the words stayed with him long after they'd returned to the castle and gone their separate ways for the night. On the third and final day of the festival, a moment occurred that Cade would replay in his mind many times over the following weeks. During the closing feast, a minor scuffle broke out between two young wolves near the mead barrels, tempers flaring over a perceived insult, voices rising loud enough to draw the attention of half the courtyard. Cade rose to intervene, but Wren was faster, stepping between the two young men with a calm, steady voice that somehow cut through their anger more effectively than any show of royal authority might have. "Whatever this is about, it's not worth ending the festival in chains," she said, and something in her tone, some deep and practiced steadiness, made both young wolves pause and actually listen. Within a minute, she had them apologizing to each other, embarrassed and sheepish, and the crowd's attention drifted away as quickly as it had gathered. "How did you do that?" Cade asked afterward, genuinely impressed. "Practice," Wren said simply, and there was that flicker again, that shadow of something unspoken crossing her face before she pushed it away. "Angry people just want to feel heard before they'll listen to reason. It's not complicated, once you've had enough practice at it." Cade wanted, badly, to ask what kind of life had given her that much practice at calming angry people, what kind of childhood had taught a healer's ward in a border village to read danger and diffuse it with such practiced ease. But he held the question back, sensing that Wren's careful walls, however curious he was about what lay behind them, would not come down through force or persistence. They would come down, if they ever did, in her own time, at her own pace, and pushing too hard now risked losing whatever fragile trust had begun to grow between them over these 3 strange, unexpected days. That night, after the festival had finally wound down and the castle grounds had emptied of vendors and revelers, Cade stood once more at his chamber window, looking out over the quiet grounds below. He thought of Wren's steady hands calming 2 angry young men, of her dry humor correcting him in front of visiting lords, of the flash of old pain that crossed her face whenever the conversation edged too close to her past. He still could not hear a single thought in her mind, and for the first time, he found himself wondering if that silence was less a mystery to solve and more a wound to understand, something that had been done to her rather than something she had chosen for herself. Whatever it was, he realized, standing alone in the dark, he no longer wanted to uncover it simply to protect his kingdom. He wanted to understand it, because he wanted to understand her, fully and completely, in a way his gift had never required him to work for with anyone else in his entire life. It was, he admitted to himself with equal parts unease and quiet wonder, the first time in 5 years of ruling that he had wanted something purely for himself, and not for the crown resting so heavily on his head. 2 weeks after the long harvest festival ended, Cade found himself once again seeking out Wren's company, though he had run out of reasonable excuses to justify it. She had returned to her kitchen duties, and he had returned to the ordinary business of ruling, yet he noticed her absence from his days more than he cared to admit, a strange, hollow feeling that made his study feel quieter, and his evenings feel longer than they used to. He solved the problem, somewhat clumsily, by inviting her to walk with him through the castle gardens, under the pretense of discussing preparations for an upcoming trade summit. Wren accepted the invitation with a raised eyebrow that suggested she saw through the excuse just as clearly as he did, but she said nothing about it, falling into step beside him as they wandered the gravel paths between rows of autumn flowers. "You don't actually need my opinion on trade summit preparations," she said, after several minutes of comfortable silence, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "No," Kate admitted, "I don't." "Then why am I here?" He considered lying, offering some smooth royal excuse about wanting a fresh perspective from outside his usual advisors. But something about the honest curiosity in her expression made him choose the truth instead. "Because I enjoy your company," he said simply. "And because I find I think more clearly when you're nearby, for reasons I haven't entirely figured out." Ren was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That's a strange thing for a king to admit to a kitchen servant," she said finally. "Is it strange, or is it simply honest?" Kate asked, echoing her own words back to her from the festival. She laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Kate felt something loosen in his chest at the sound of it. "Fair enough," she said. "I suppose I enjoy your company too, though I can't imagine what use that is to anyone." They continued walking, the conversation drifting into easier territory, Ren asking questions about the history of the garden, Kate explaining which flowers his mother had planted decades ago and which had been added since her passing. It was, he realized, one of the few conversations he'd had in years that felt entirely free of political calculation, free of the careful weighing of words that came with every other relationship in his life. With Ren, he simply spoke, and she simply listened, and neither of them seemed to be performing for the other's benefit. It was during this conversation, as they paused near a bench overlooking the garden's central fountain, that Ren said something that made Cade's entire body go still. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to figure something out," she said, watching him with sharp, perceptive eyes. "Like you're listening for something you're not hearing." Cade's breath caught. It was such a precise description of what he'd been doing since the coronation feast that for a moment he couldn't find any words at all. "What makes you say that?" he managed finally, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "I don't know," Ren said, looking away toward the fountain, her brow furrowing as though she were trying to solve a puzzle in her own mind. "It's just a feeling I get sometimes, around you, and only you. Like there's a conversation happening that I'm not part of." She paused, then laughed uncomfortably, shaking her head as if to dismiss her own words. "That sounds mad. Forget I said anything." "It doesn't sound mad," Cade said quietly, his mind racing. Could she sense his gift somehow, even without being able to hear it working? Could there be some part of her, buried beneath whatever kept her silent to him, that recognized the strange attention his ability paid to every other mind in the room? Cade. It was the first time she'd used his name without the formal title, and the sound of it in her voice sent a strange warmth through his chest, despite the tension of the moment. "What are you not telling me?" He weighed his answer carefully, aware that this was a threshold, that whatever he said next would shape everything that followed between them. He wasn't ready, not yet, to explain the full truth of his gift and the impossible silence surrounding her mind. It felt too large, too strange, too likely to frighten her away before he understood any of it himself. But he also couldn't bring himself to lie to her outright, not when she was looking at him with such careful, searching honesty. "I have a gift," he said slowly, choosing his words with great care, "one that lets me sense things about the people around me. Most of the time, it works without me even trying. Around you, it doesn't work at all. I don't understand why, and it's been troubling me since the night we met." Ren's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, surprise first, then something that looked almost like fear, quickly suppressed, and hidden away behind her usual careful composure. "What kind of gift?" she asked, her voice tighter now, more guarded than it had been moments before. "The kind that lets me hear the surface thoughts of every wolf in my kingdom," Cade said, watching her reaction closely. "Every wolf except you." For a long moment, Ren said nothing at all, staring at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, somewhere between shock and a strange, dawning recognition, as though he had just confirmed something she had always suspected, without ever having the words to name it. "That's not possible," she said finally, though her voice lacked real conviction. "No one has ever been able to hear my thoughts, not once, not ever, not since I was a child." "You knew," Cade said, understanding dawning slowly. "You knew you were different." I knew I was strange, Wren corrected, wrapping her arms around herself, as though suddenly cold, despite the mild autumn air. The healer who raised me used to say I had an old soul, that I was harder to read than most children my age. I thought she meant it kindly, as a compliment. I never understood what it actually meant until right now, standing here with you telling me you can hear everyone's thoughts except mine. Cade watched her carefully, aware that he had just crossed a line he could not uncross, revealing a piece of himself that very few people in his kingdom truly understood. I'm not upset by it, he said gently. If anything, I find it fascinating. I've never met anyone like you before. That's easy for you to say, Wren said, and there was an edge in her voice now, something raw and unguarded breaking through her careful composure. You've spent your whole life being able to see straight into everyone around you. Do you have any idea what it's like to wonder your entire life, why you always feel like you're standing just slightly outside of everything, why people sometimes look at you strangely, like they're trying to place something they can't quite name? No, Cade admitted honestly, I don't. But I'd like to understand, if you're willing to let me. Wren studied him for a long moment, her expression cycling through wariness and something softer, something that looked almost like hope, despite her obvious effort to guard against it. I don't know what I am, she said finally, quietly, as though the admission cost her something significant to speak aloud. I've never known. I've just learned to live with not knowing. Then maybe we figure it out together, Cade said, and meant it more sincerely than he'd meant almost anything in years. She didn't answer right away, but she also didn't pull away when he reached out and gently took her hand, a small gesture that felt, in that quiet garden with the fountain murmuring beside them, like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them, in their own careful way, wanted to see through to whatever truth waited on the other side. Word of trouble at the northern border reached Cade 3 days later, delivered by a breathless messenger who had ridden through the night to bring the news. The Thornwood pack, longtime rivals of the Vantoran throne, had moved a significant force to the disputed hunting grounds along the river, well beyond the boundaries agreed upon in the last treaty signed nearly a decade ago. It was not yet an attack, but it was an unmistakable provocation, the kind of move that demanded a careful and immediate response. Cade called his council together within the hour, gathering his senior advisors, his guard captain, and his sister Alira, whose sharp political instincts had proven invaluable more than once since her own coronation. They spread maps across the long table in the war room, tracing the Thornwood movements, debating whether this was a genuine attempt to claim territory, or simply a test of the young king's resolve. They've chosen their timing carefully, Alira observed, studying the map with narrowed eyes. Right after the harvest festival, when our stores are stretched thin, and half our guard captains are still recovering from 3 days of ceremonial duty, which suggests someone told them exactly when we'd be least prepared, Rel said grimly, and the room fell into an uneasy silence at the implication. Cade had considered the same possibility already, turning it over in his mind since the messenger's first report. It would not be the first time a rival pack had benefited from information that should never have left his inner council. But the timing bothered him for another reason as well, one he didn't voice aloud in front of the full council. The Thornwood's knowledge of his schedule, his guard rotations, even the specific vulnerabilities in his border defenses, suggested access to conversations that had happened within this very room, among people he had trusted enough never to scrutinize with his gift. He began doing so now, quietly and deliberately, listening to the surface thoughts of every advisor seated around the table as they debated strategy. Most of what he heard was exactly what he expected: genuine concern, calculations of troop movements, worry over the cost of a prolonged conflict. But beneath the surface of one mind, he caught something else entirely, a thread of careful, controlled anxiety that didn't match the calm expression on the wolf's face. Counselor Hadrick Osgood, a longtime advisor who had served both Cade's father and Cade himself, was thinking with unusual precision about which details he had already shared and which he still needed to convey. A rehearsed, careful anxiety that had nothing to do with the Thornwood threat and everything to do with hiding his own role in it. Cade said nothing in the moment, keeping his expression neutral as the council continued debating strategy, but his mind raced with the implications. He would need proof before he could act, something concrete enough to bring formal charges against a man who had served his family for over 20 years. Accusing a counselor of treason on the strength of an overheard thought alone, however certain that thought had felt, would tear his court apart with suspicion and doubt if he was wrong. That evening, after the council had dispersed to prepare their various responses to the border situation, Cade found Wren in the castle gardens, where she had taken to walking in the quiet hour after her kitchen duties ended. She noticed his troubled expression immediately, setting aside the herbs she'd been gathering for the kitchen stores. "Something's wrong," she said. Not a question, but a simple observation. "The Thorn would have moved troops to the border," Cade said, sitting heavily on the bench beside the fountain. "And I believe someone within my own council has been feeding them information." Wren sat beside him, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "You believe, or you know?" "I believe," Cade said. "I heard something in Counselor Osgood's thoughts today that doesn't sit right. But suspicion isn't proof, and I can't move against him without something concrete." "Why are you telling me this?" Wren asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I'm a kitchen servant. This is well beyond anything I should have any part in." Cade considered the question seriously before answering. "Because you're the only person in this entire castle whose thoughts I can't hear," he said. "Which means you're also the only person I can be completely certain isn't hiding anything from me through some trick of my own gift. Everyone else, I have to wonder if what I'm hearing is truly their thought, or something they've learned to project deliberately. With you, there's no question. What you tell me is simply what you choose to tell me, nothing more and nothing less." Wren absorbed this for a long moment, and Cade watched something shift in her expression, a kind of quiet understanding settling over her features. "You trust me because you can't read me," she said slowly. "That's strange, isn't it? Most people would find that terrifying, not trustworthy. Most people haven't spent 5 years listening to every unspoken thought around them," Cade said. "You'd be surprised how exhausting it becomes, knowing that even the people who smile at you are often thinking something entirely different underneath. With you, at least, I know there's no gap between what I hear and what's true. There's simply nothing to hear at all, and somehow that feels more honest than anything my gift has ever given me." Wren was quiet for a while, watching the fountain's steady flow of water catch the last light of the evening sun. "I want to help," she said finally. "With whatever this is, the border trouble, the counselor. I don't know how useful I can be, but I'd like to try." "This could be dangerous," Cade said, though even as he spoke the words, he found himself wanting her involvement rather than dreading it. A strange shift from the caution he knew he should be feeling. "I've survived dangerous things before," Wren said simply, and there it was again, that same careful reference to a past she never fully explained, a shadow crossing briefly over her expression before she pushed it away and refocused on the matter at hand. "Tell me what you need." Over the following days, Cade found himself relying on Wren in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her position among the kitchen staff gave her access to conversations and observations that never reached the formal channels of his council. Servants noticed things nobles didn't, unusual visitors arriving at odd hours, private messages passed discreetly between hands that weren't meant to be seen exchanging anything at all. Wren began quietly gathering these small observations, reporting them to Cade during their evening walks in the garden, and slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. Counselor Osgood had been meeting privately with a merchant who claimed to trade in southern spices but who, according to 2 separate kitchen staff who had noticed him lingering near the castle's private entrances, never actually delivered any goods at all. The meetings always happened late in the evening, always brief, always conducted with a level of secrecy that made little sense for an ordinary trade arrangement. "It's not proof," Wren said one evening, laying out what she'd learned as they sat together in the garden, the autumn air growing steadily colder around them. "But it's a pattern, and patterns are usually trying to tell you something." "It's more than I had a week ago," Cade said, genuinely grateful for her help, and for the first time since the border news had arrived, he felt something like real hope that they might untangle this threat before it grew into something far more dangerous than a suspicious counselor and a merchant who never delivered his goods. As they sat together in the fading evening light, Cade found his gaze drifting to Wren more often than the conversation strictly required, taking in the focused, thoughtful expression on her face as she worked through the details of what they'd gathered. Whatever she was, whatever strange gift or old wound had made her silent to his own ability, he found himself grateful, in a way that went far beyond simple political usefulness, that fate had placed her in his path. The border crisis was real, and growing more dangerous by the day. But sitting beside her in the quiet garden, Cade found it strangely difficult to feel entirely afraid of anything at all. The stranger appeared at the edge of the market square on a gray, overcast afternoon, watching Wren from beneath the hood of a traveling cloak as she moved between stalls, gathering the last of the season's herbs for the kitchen stores. She noticed him almost immediately, some old instinct prickling at the back of her neck, the way it always did when danger drew close, though she couldn't have said exactly what about him triggered the feeling. He was an older man, weathered and lean, with pale eyes that studied her far too intently for a stranger passing through the capital. When their eyes finally met across the crowded square, he didn't look away, didn't offer the polite, brief glance of a stranger's curiosity. Instead, he held her gaze with an unsettling steadiness, and after a long moment, he spoke a name she hadn't heard in years, a name that didn't belong to her at all. "Sable," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for her to hear, over the noise of the market. "It's been a long time." Wren froze, her basket of herbs nearly slipping from her fingers. "You have the wrong person," she said carefully, backing a step away. "My name is Wren." The man's expression didn't change, a faint, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Is it?" he said, not quite a question. "Funny. You have your mother's eyes exactly. I'd know them anywhere." Something cold settled in Wren's chest, an old, buried fear rising up from wherever she'd kept it locked away for years. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though her voice wavered slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "You were never meant to survive the winter you were born," the man continued, stepping closer despite her obvious discomfort, his voice low and urgent now, meant only for her ears. "Someone worked very hard to make sure of it, and someone else worked just as hard to hide you from them. I think it's time you understood which side of that you're standing on." "Who are you?" Wren demanded, her hand instinctively closing around the small knife she kept tucked in her apron for kitchen work, though the gesture felt woefully inadequate against whatever this stranger actually represented. "Someone who knew your mother," he said. "Someone who's been looking for you for a very long time. You're in danger here, more than you understand, and the longer you stay close to that castle, the more danger you bring down on both of you." Before Wren could press him further, demand real answers instead of cryptic warnings, the man melted back into the crowd, with a speed that seemed impossible for someone of his apparent age, leaving her standing alone in the market square, her basket of herbs forgotten at her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't tell Cade immediately. For 2 full days, she carried the stranger's words alone, turning them over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of a warning that explained nothing, while somehow confirming every uneasy feeling she'd carried her entire life. The healer who raised her had always been vague about her origins, offering only the same simple story, found on a doorstep in winter. No note, no clue to her parentage, taken in, out of simple kindness. Wren had never questioned it deeply as a child. But the stranger's words, and the name he'd called her, Sable, sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge. It was Cade who finally noticed something was wrong, during one of their evening walks in the garden, when Wren's usual steady composure kept slipping, her attention drifting, her answers to his questions arriving a beat too slow. "Something happened," he said, stopping beside the fountain, and turning to face her directly. "You've been distracted for 2 days. Tell me." Wren hesitated, weighing how much to share. Old habits of caution warring with the strange, new trust that had grown between them over the past weeks. Finally, she told him everything. The stranger in the market square, the name Sable, the warning about danger she didn't understand. Cade's expression grew increasingly serious as she spoke, his mind already racing through the implications. "Sable," he repeated slowly. "That's not a name I recognize from any noble house I know of, but if someone tried to harm you as an infant, and someone else hid you well enough that even my gift can't reach your thoughts, that suggests protection on a scale that goes far beyond an ordinary healer taking in an orphaned child." "You think it's connected to your gift," Wren said, understanding dawning in her expression, "that whatever keeps you from hearing my thoughts was done deliberately, to protect me from someone." "It's the only explanation that makes sense," Cade said. "Natural silence like yours doesn't simply happen. Someone with real power would have needed to create it, and they wouldn't have gone to that trouble unless the alternative was something far worse. They sat together in tense silence for a while, the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on both of them. Ren wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the dark water of the fountain as though it might offer answers the rest of the world hadn't. "I need to find him again," she said finally. "The stranger. I need to know what he knows." "That could be dangerous," Cade said immediately. "If he's telling the truth about someone wanting you dead as an infant, walking toward him alone isn't wisdom, it's recklessness." "I've spent my whole life not knowing who I am," Ren said, her voice steady despite the fear Cade could see plainly in her eyes now. "I can't keep living with that uncertainty, especially not now that I know it might be connected to something real and dangerous. I have to understand what I'm made of, Cade. I have to know." Cade studied her for a long moment, recognizing the same stubborn determination in her expression that he'd seen the night of the kitchen fire, the same fierce refusal to simply freeze and wait for danger to pass her by. "Then you won't go alone," he said firmly. "Whatever this is, whatever we find, we face it together. I won't let you walk into uncertain danger by yourself, not when I have the resources of an entire kingdom at my disposal to help protect you." Ren looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and something deeper, something neither of them had fully named yet despite the weeks of growing closeness between them. "Why do you care this much?" she asked quietly. "I'm still just a kitchen servant to everyone else in this castle. You could have simply let your investigation end weeks ago, once you realized I wasn't an obvious threat." "Because somewhere along the way," Cade said, holding her gaze steadily, "you stopped being a mystery to solve, and became someone I couldn't imagine my days without. I don't fully understand what you are, Ren, or Sable, or whatever name truly belongs to you. But I know what I feel when I'm with you, and it has nothing to do with my gift or my crown. It's simply you, and that's enough for me." The confession hung in the cool evening air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the fountain's steady murmur the only sound in the quiet garden. Then Ren reached out and took his hand, her grip firm despite the uncertainty still shadowing her eyes, and Cade understood, without needing his gift to confirm it, that whatever they found when they finally uncovered the truth of her past, they would face it together, bound now by something far stronger than simple curiosity or royal duty. Finding the stranger again proved easier than either of them expected. He found them first, 3 days later, waiting near the edge of the forest path that bordered the castle grounds, as though he had known all along they would eventually come looking for him. Rel trailed a discreet distance behind Cade and Ren, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger, but the old man made no threatening move as they approached, simply watching them with the same steady, pale-eyed patience he'd shown in the market square. "Alpha King," he said, offering a shallow bow that carried more mockery than respect. "I wondered how long it would take her to bring you along." "Tell me who you are," Cade said, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, though the man seemed entirely unbothered by it. "My name is Corwin," the stranger said. "I served your father once, many years ago, before circumstances made that position untenable, and before that, I served a woman named Isolde, who was Ren's mother, though she went by a different name in the years I knew her." Ren's breath caught audibly. "Tell me about her," she said, stepping forward despite Cade's protective hand at her back. Corwin studied her for a long moment before continuing. "Isolde was born into a bloodline older than your family's throne, Alpha King, one your own father spent considerable effort trying to erase decades ago. A bloodline with its own gifts, its own claims to power that predated the Vantoran rule by generations. Your father saw them as a threat to his authority, and he was not entirely wrong to. When he moved against them, most of that bloodline was destroyed. Isolde survived, barely, and fled south, carrying a child she knew would never be safe if her true parentage became known." Cade felt the ground shift beneath the story. Old history he'd never fully understood, suddenly taking on new and troubling shape. He had known, distantly, that his father had eliminated a rival bloodline early in his reign, some old threat to the throne's legitimacy that had never been discussed in detail, even within the family. He had never imagined it might still cast a shadow this long, this far into his own reign. "What happened to her?" Ren asked, her voice tight with emotion. "My mother. She died protecting you. Corwin said, more gently now, some genuine sympathy softening his weathered features. When your father's hunters finally caught up with her, 4 years after your birth, she used the last of her power to hide you completely, weaving a protection so thorough that no one, not even a gifted alpha like the one standing beside you now, would ever be able to sense your true nature. It cost her everything to do it. She died so that you could disappear entirely, safe from anyone who might recognize what you carried in your blood. Ren's composure finally cracked, tears spilling silently down her cheeks, as she absorbed a truth she'd waited her entire life to hear, however painful it turned out to be. Cade stepped closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without hesitation, the weight of years of unanswered questions finally settling into place, however devastating the answer proved to be. Why are you telling us this now? Cade asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. Why not simply continue leaving her hidden, if that's what her mother sacrificed everything to achieve? Because the protection is beginning to fail, Corwin said grimly. Magic of that scale doesn't last forever, especially not magic cast in desperation with the last of a dying woman's strength. I've watched from a distance for years, making certain no one else discovered what I already knew. But there are others searching, Alpha King, others who serve interests far more dangerous than simple curiosity. If the Thornwood have truly moved against your borders, I suspect it's no coincidence that this threat has emerged now, just as her protection begins to weaken. The implications settled heavily over all three of them. Cade thought immediately of Counselor Osgood, of the careful anxiety he'd caught in the man's thoughts during the Border Council meeting, and a new, chilling possibility took shape in his mind. What if the Thornwood's interest in destabilizing his throne wasn't purely political? What if someone within his own court had learned, or suspected, exactly what Ren truly was, and had begun using that knowledge as leverage against a far older and more dangerous enemy? You said my mother's bloodline had its own gifts, Ren said, wiping her eyes and straightening with visible effort, some of her usual steady composure returning, even through the shock of everything she'd just learned. What gifts? What am I actually capable of? Corwin's expression turned thoughtful, almost sorrowful. I don't fully know, he admitted. The bloodline was nearly wiped out before its full nature could be properly studied or understood, even by those within it. What I do know is that your resistance to the Alpha gift is not simply a shield your mother built. It's a reflection of what you already were, amplified and protected by her sacrifice. The blood in your veins was never meant to be read by anyone, not because it was hidden, but because it was never fully of this world's ordinary nature to begin with. The words hung heavy in the cool forest air, raising more questions than they answered, and Cade could see the toll this revelation was taking on Ren, the exhaustion and grief and confusion warring visibly across her expression. He made a decision quickly, firmly, the kind of decision he'd learned to make as king when a situation demanded immediate protection over lingering uncertainty. You'll come back to the castle with us, Cade said, addressing Corwin directly. Under guard, but as a guest, not a prisoner. I want everything you know written down and studied properly, and I want protection extended to you as well, given how much danger your knowledge apparently represents to certain interested parties. Corwin studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's more generosity than I expected from a Vantoran king, he said. Your father would have simply had me silenced to protect his own secrets. I'm not my father, Cade said simply, and found, as he said it, that the words carried more conviction than he'd expected. Whatever his father had done decades ago, whatever fear or ambition had driven him to eliminate an entire bloodline, Cade had no intention of continuing that legacy of destruction, not when the last surviving thread of that bloodline stood beside him now, trembling with grief, but unmistakably, fiercely alive. As they walked back toward the castle together, Corwin trailing quietly behind under Rel's watchful escort, Cade reached for Ren's hand and found her fingers already reaching for his, a silent, steady connection that needed no words to explain itself. She had spent her entire life not knowing what she was, carrying an unexplained silence at the center of her own existence like an old, unhealed wound. Now, finally, she had answers, however painful and incomplete they remained. And Cade understood, walking beside her through the darkening forest path, that the true danger to both of them was only just beginning to take shape, a threat far older and more deeply rooted than a simple border dispute or a single treacherous counselor. Somewhere in his own court, someone had likely uncovered a truth that should have remained buried forever, and was now using that knowledge as a weapon against them both. Whatever came next, Cade knew with absolute certainty that he would face it standing beside Ren, not as her king protecting a subject, but as an equal, bound to her now by something far stronger than duty or curiosity ever could have been alone. Corwin's presence in the castle, quiet and carefully guarded, gave Cade the opening he needed to move against Counselor Osgood, with more than mere suspicion behind him. Over the following days, Corwin helped piece together fragments of the old conflict between Cade's father and Ren's mother's bloodline, revealing names and old alliances that had faded from official record, but clearly still lingered in the memories of those who had once been part of that dangerous history. Among those names was a distant cousin of Osgood's, someone who had profited handsomely from the original purge decades ago, receiving land and titles that had once belonged to the eliminated bloodline. Land doesn't simply forget where it came from, Corwin observed, as he and Cade reviewed old property records late one evening in the castle archives. If Osgood learned somehow that Ren was the last surviving heir to that bloodline, he'd understand better than almost anyone else in your court exactly what that could mean for his own family's holdings, should the full truth ever come to light, and demand some measure of restitution. It was a motive Cade could understand all too well, the kind of quiet, self-interested fear that curdled into betrayal over years of careful, hidden calculation. He ordered Rel to place discreet surveillance on Osgood's movements and correspondence, and within a week, they had what they needed. A letter, intercepted before it could reach its intended courier, confirmed everything they had suspected. Osgood had indeed discovered rumors of Ren's true parentage, likely through some old connection to the original purge, and had been quietly feeding information to the Thornwood pack, in exchange for their promise to eliminate her, before her identity could ever be confirmed and used against his family's interests. Cade called Osgood to his study alone, dismissing the guards from the room despite Rel's obvious discomfort with the arrangement. He wanted this conversation to happen without an audience, without the added complication of witnesses who might report the confrontation before Cade had decided exactly how he wanted to handle it. "You've been busy," Cade said, sliding the intercepted letter across his desk as Osgood entered, watching the older wolf's composure crack the moment his eyes landed on his own handwriting. Osgood's face went pale, but he recovered quickly, drawing himself up with the kind of practiced dignity that had served him well through decades of court politics. "My lord, I can explain." "You can," Cade agreed evenly. "And you will, in full, before this council, and before every witness necessary to ensure justice is properly served. But first, I want you to understand something clearly. The woman you tried to have eliminated is not simply a servant caught up in old political games. She is under my direct protection, and any harm that comes to her, whether by your hand or by the Thornwood you've been conspiring with, will be treated as a direct act of treason against the throne itself." "You don't understand what you're protecting," Osgood said, his voice rising with something between fear and genuine conviction. "Her bloodline nearly destroyed this kingdom once before, my lord. Your own father recognized the danger and acted to prevent it. I was simply continuing the wisdom of his judgment. My father's judgment led to the slaughter of innocent people, including a mother who died protecting her child from exactly the kind of fear you're describing right now," Cade said, his voice cold and unwavering. "I've made my own judgment, Osgood, and it differs sharply from my father's. You will face formal charges for treason, for conspiracy with a hostile pack, and for the attempted murder of a woman under royal protection. Whatever fear drove you to this betrayal, it does not excuse the choice you made to act on it." Osgood was arrested within the hour, his private chambers searched and further evidence gathered to support the formal charges Cade intended to bring before the full council. But the danger was far from resolved. With Osgood's betrayal exposed, the Thornwood pack, now aware that their inside source had been compromised, would likely accelerate whatever plans they had already set into motion, and Cade knew there was little time left to prepare adequate defenses. He found Ren in the garden that evening, going over the details of Osgood's arrest with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. She listened carefully as he explained everything, her expression steady despite the enormity of what they'd just confirmed, a counselor who had served the throne for decades, willing to conspire in her death simply to protect old family holdings. "He wasn't wrong to be afraid," Ren said quietly, once Cade had finished. If what Corwin told us is true, my bloodline really did once pose a threat to the Vantoran throne. Maybe his fear wasn't entirely unreasonable, even if his methods were monstrous. Fear doesn't excuse conspiracy to murder, Cade said firmly. Whatever threat your bloodline once represented, that threat belonged to a conflict that happened before either of us were born. You've done nothing except survive, Ren. That's not a crime deserving of death, no matter how frightened Osgood or anyone else might be of what your existence represents. Ren was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words, before a small, grateful smile finally broke through her worried expression. You keep saying things like that, she said softly. Like my life matters just as much as any noble-born wolf's life would. Because it does, Cade said simply, reaching for her hand. It matters more to me than almost anything else in this entire kingdom, if I'm being completely honest. The moment was interrupted by Rel's urgent arrival, his expression grim, as he delivered fresh news from the border. My lord, scouts report the Thornwood have begun moving in force. This isn't a provocation anymore. They're preparing for a full assault, likely within the next 2 days, judging by the speed of their advance. Cade's mind shifted immediately into the sharp, focused clarity that crisis always demanded of him, years of training and responsibility settling over his shoulders like familiar armor. Gather the full council, he said. We need every available guard positioned along the border by morning, and I want the castle's own defenses reinforced as well, in case this assault is meant to draw our attention away from a more direct strike here at the capital. Rel nodded and hurried away to begin issuing orders, and Cade turned back to Ren, who had risen from the garden bench, her expression steady despite the obvious danger now bearing down on all of them. I want you somewhere safe, Cade said, though even as he spoke the words, he suspected exactly how she would respond to them. I fought that kitchen fire without hesitation, Ren said, her chin lifting with the same fierce determination he'd come to recognize and admire in her. I'm not going to hide in a locked room while people I care about face real danger on my behalf. Whatever comes next, Cade, I intend to face it standing beside you, not tucked away somewhere safe and useless. Cade wanted to argue, wanted to insist on her safety above all other considerations, but looking into her steady, determined eyes, he understood that this was a battle he would not win, and more than that, he understood that he didn't actually want to win it. Ren had spent her entire life fighting simply to survive, learning early that safety was never guaranteed, and always worth claiming for herself, rather than waiting passively for someone else to provide it. Asking her to abandon that hard-won strength now, even out of love and genuine fear for her safety, would have been asking her to become someone she had never been and never wanted to be. Then we face it together, he said finally, echoing the promise he'd made to her days before in the forest. And as the castle around them began preparing for the coming conflict, urgent voices and hurried footsteps filling the corridors with the tense energy of imminent battle, Cade found a strange, steady calm settling over him, born entirely from the certainty that whatever the Thornwood brought against them, he would not face it alone, and neither would she. The Thornwood assault came at dawn, exactly as the scouts had predicted, a wave of warriors crashing against the northern border defenses, with a ferocity that spoke of long, careful planning, rather than a hasty response to Osgood's arrest. Cade rode out with his personal guard to meet the initial assault, leaving Rel in command of the castle's own defenses, uncertain whether the border attack was the true threat or simply a distraction, meant to draw his strongest forces away from the capital. That uncertainty proved well-founded. As Cade's forces engaged the Thornwood along the river, a second, smaller group of attackers moved against the castle itself, slipping through a service entrance that Osgood, it would later be discovered, had disclosed to his co-conspirators weeks before his arrest. Rel's forces caught the intrusion quickly, but not before several attackers had breached the outer walls, spreading chaos through the castle's lower levels, where the kitchen staff and other servants were still going about their morning duties, unaware that danger had already found its way inside. Ren was in the kitchen when the alarm bells began ringing, the familiar space suddenly filled with panicked shouting as word spread that armed intruders had breached the castle. Her first instinct, honed by years of learning to survive rather than freeze, was to herd the younger kitchen staff toward the reinforced storage cellar, the safest space available in the chaos, before turning back toward the sound of clashing steel echoing down the corridor. "Where are you going?" One of the older cooks called after her, alarmed. "To help," Wren said simply, grabbing a heavy kitchen knife from the counter. The same steady determination that had once sent her running toward a burning pantry, now carrying her toward the sound of battle instead. She found Rel's forces engaged with 3 Thornwood warriors in the main corridor, the guards clearly outmatched in numbers despite their superior training. Without hesitation, Wren threw herself into the fight, using her knowledge of the castle's layout to her advantage, driving one attacker back into a narrow alcove, where his greater size became a disadvantage rather than a strength. It wasn't elegant combat, nothing like the trained swordplay of Rel's guards, but it was effective, born of pure survival instinct, and a fierce refusal to let danger simply wash over her without a fight. "Get behind me," Rel shouted, finally noticing her presence amid the chaos, though there was something like respect mixed into his obvious alarm. "I can help," Wren shot back, ducking beneath a wild swing and driving her knife into the gap beneath her attacker's arm, forcing him to stagger back with a pained shout. Between her unexpected assistance and Rel's disciplined guards, the 3 intruders were quickly subdued, disarmed, and bound, though not before one of Rel's younger guards took a serious wound to the shoulder that left blood pooling steadily on the stone floor. Word reached Cade at the border of the castle breach within the hour, carried by a swift messenger who found him in the thick of the ongoing engagement against the Thornwood forces. The news sent a spike of pure terror through him, sharper and more consuming than any fear he'd felt in years of ruling and defending his kingdom, and he broke from the main engagement immediately, leaving his most trusted lieutenant in command of the border defense while he rode back toward the capital with a small, fast escort, his mind consumed entirely by fear for Wren's safety. He arrived at the castle to find the immediate crisis already resolved, Rel's forces having successfully repelled the breach with Wren's unexpected assistance, but the sight that greeted him in the main courtyard still stopped his heart cold. Wren stood near the wounded guard, her hands pressed firmly against his shoulder wound, blood staining her apron and forearms, her expression fierce with concentration as she worked to slow the bleeding until proper healers could arrive. "You're hurt," Cade said, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion, as he took in the blood covering her hands and arms, unable in the chaos of the moment to immediately tell whether it belonged to her or to the wounded guard beneath her care. "It's not mine," Wren said quickly, understanding his fear immediately, and moving to reassure him, even as she continued applying pressure to the guard's wound. "I'm fine, Cade, truly. Help me get him to the healers. He's lost a great deal of blood." Cade forced his racing heart to steady, falling into the practical urgency of the moment, helping lift the wounded guard, and carrying him swiftly toward the castle's healing wing, where Wren continued assisting with a calm, capable competence that surprised even the trained healers working to save the young guard's life. It was only once the immediate crisis had passed, once the guard's condition had stabilized, and the healers had assured everyone that he would recover fully, that Cade finally allowed himself to fully process what had happened. He found Wren afterward in a quiet side chamber, washing the blood from her hands and arms, her earlier fierce composure finally beginning to crack now that the immediate danger had passed. Cade crossed the room without a word and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly enough that she made a small sound of surprise before relaxing into the embrace, her damp hands coming to rest against his chest. "I thought something had happened to you," Cade said quietly, his voice still rough with the fear he'd carried the entire ride back from the border. "I've never been more afraid in my entire life." "I fought back," Wren said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I wasn't going to just wait and hope someone else would keep everyone safe. Not when I could actually help." "I know," Cade said, pulling back slightly to look at her properly, taking in the exhaustion and lingering adrenaline still visible in her expression. "And I'm proud of you for it, even though it terrified me. You saved that guard's life today, Wren. You fought off armed intruders with nothing but a kitchen knife and pure determination. That's not something an ordinary servant does. That's something extraordinary." Word of the border battle arrived shortly after, carried by another messenger, with news that considerably eased the tension still gripping the castle. The Thornwood assault had been successfully repelled, their forces retreating back across the border after suffering significant losses, their momentum broken by the strong defense Cade's lieutenant had organized in his absence. Combined with the failure of their coordinated attack on the castle itself, The border assault had cost the Thornwood far more than they had gained, and initial reports suggested their leadership was already sending envoys to discuss terms, rather than risk a prolonged and costly conflict. The immediate crisis, born of Osgood's betrayal and years of hidden fear surrounding Wren's true bloodline, had finally reached its conclusion, though the cost had been significant on both sides. As the castle slowly began settling back into a more ordinary rhythm over the following days, Cade found himself reflecting often on the moment he'd found Wren covered in another wolf's blood, fierce and unafraid despite the danger surrounding her, and understood with absolute clarity that whatever future awaited them, it would be built on exactly that kind of shared courage, the kind that faced danger together rather than hiding from it separately. Wren, for her part, seemed to carry a new kind of quiet confidence in the days following the battle, as though proving her loyalty and courage so decisively had finally settled something long uncertain within herself. She was no longer simply a mysterious servant with an unexplained silence at the center of her existence. She had become, through her own fierce actions during the crisis, something the entire castle now recognized and respected in her own right. A woman who had chosen, without hesitation, to fight for a home and a people that had only recently become fully her own. 3 weeks after the Thornwood retreat, the great hall of Van Toren Castle filled once more with candlelight and gathered nobles, though this feast carried none of the uncertain tension that had haunted the coronation celebration months before. Peace terms had been formally signed with the Thornwood, their envoys departing with a treaty that re-established clear border boundaries and included a substantial payment in restitution for the attempted assault. Councillor Osgood's trial had concluded as well, his conspiracy fully exposed before the full council, his titles stripped, and his fate left to the formal judgment of the kingdom's laws, a resolution that brought quiet closure to the betrayal that had nearly cost so many lives. Cade stood at the head of the hall, watching the gathered nobles and guards and staff mingle in genuine celebration, rather than the careful political performance that usually marked such occasions. Beside him, dressed now in a gown of deep blue silk rather than her familiar kitchen uniform, stood Wren, her dark hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since he'd known her, looking every bit as uncertain about the formal setting as she looked genuinely happy to be standing there beside him. "Everyone is staring," she murmured, leaning close enough that only he could hear her. "Let them stare," Cade said, taking her hand and lacing his fingers through hers without hesitation, a public gesture he'd never once made with anyone else in his 5 years as king. "I have an announcement to make, and I'd like you standing beside me when I make it." Wren's eyes widened slightly, though she didn't pull away, some deep trust in him, steadying whatever nerves the sudden attention stirred in her. Cade raised his free hand, and the hall gradually quieted, the musicians pausing their playing, the gathered crowd turning their full attention toward their king. "Many of you have heard fragments of the truth by now," Cade began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. "About the woman standing beside me, about the betrayal that nearly cost this kingdom dearly, about the ancient history that connects her bloodline to struggles this throne faced, long before either of us were born. I won't pretend the full story is simple, or that every question surrounding her past has been fully answered. But I want to be equally clear about what I do know, with absolute certainty." He turned to look at Wren directly, and something in his expression softened even as his voice remained steady and strong enough for the entire hall to hear. "I have spent my entire life able to hear the thoughts of every wolf in this kingdom, a gift that has protected this throne through 5 years of my reign and 30 years of my father's before mine. It is a gift I have relied on to know who I could trust and who I needed to watch carefully. And then I met a woman whose mind remained entirely silent to that gift, no matter how hard I reached for it, and I discovered something I never expected to learn." The hall remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on their king as he continued. "I learned that trust, built on hearing someone's unspoken thoughts, is a shallow kind of trust, compared to trust earned through actions, through courage, through choices made freely, without any magic forcing honesty upon them. Wren Calloway fought to protect this castle with nothing but a kitchen knife and pure determination when danger came through our own walls. She helped uncover a betrayal that my own gift had failed to catch cleanly on its own, and she has shown me, every single day since I first met her, exactly who she is through her own choices, without ever needing my ability to confirm a single word of it. He turned fully to face her now, taking both her hands in his, and Ren's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears, though a small, hopeful smile had begun spreading across her face as she understood where his words were leading. "I am naming Ren Calloway as my equal in this court, effective immediately," Cade announced, his voice ringing with certainty across the hushed hall. "Not because of any bloodline or ancient claim, though I understand there are those in this hall who already know something of that history. But because she has earned that place through her own courage and character, in ways my gift could never have measured or confirmed on its own. I choose her, freely and completely, not despite the silence between us, but because of everything that silence taught me about what real trust actually means." The hall erupted into a mixture of murmured surprise and genuine applause, nobles and staff alike reacting with varying degrees of shock and delight at the unprecedented announcement. Alira, watching from near the front of the crowd, wore an expression of open, delighted approval, clearly unsurprised by a development she'd likely suspected for weeks now, given her sharp political instincts. Ren, for her part, simply looked at Cade with an expression of pure, overwhelmed joy, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, despite the wide smile lighting her entire face. "You didn't need to make it so public," she said softly, though there was no real complaint in her voice, only warm affection. "Yes, I did," Cade said gently. "You spent your entire life hidden, silenced, protected only by staying invisible to the world. I want the opposite for you now. I want everyone in this kingdom to know exactly who you are, and exactly how much you matter, not just to me, but to the future of this entire throne." Later that evening, once the formal celebration had wound down and the hall had begun emptying of its excited, still murmuring guests, Cade and Ren found themselves alone once more, in the same garden where so much of their story had unfolded, the fountain's steady murmur, the only sound accompanying the quiet, comfortable silence between them. "I used to think the silence in my mind was a curse," Ren said, watching the moonlight ripple across the fountain's surface. "Something that made me strange, unreadable, impossible to fully understand or trust. I spent years believing that silence was the reason I always felt slightly apart from everyone around me." "And now?" Cade asked, watching her with quiet, patient affection. "Now I think it might have been the greatest gift my mother ever gave me," Ren said, turning to look at him with steady, clear eyes, "because it meant that when you finally chose me, it was truly me you were choosing. Not a thought you overheard, not a secret you caught unaware. Just me, exactly as I am, freely offered and freely accepted." Cade reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his heart full, in a way he'd never fully experienced before meeting her. "That's exactly it," he said softly. "Out of every mind in this entire kingdom, yours became the one voice I trusted most completely, precisely because it was the one voice my gift could never simply take without your willing permission. Everything you've ever given me, Ren, every word, every choice, every moment of trust, you gave freely, and that has made it worth more to me than anything my gift has ever shown me in my entire life." The moon rose higher over the quiet castle grounds, and somewhere in the sleeping kingdom below, a counselor sat imprisoned, awaiting his fate, and a boarder stood newly secured by hard-won peace, and an old family history finally rested in the open, rather than buried beneath decades of fear and silence. But in the garden, beneath the steady stars, none of that mattered nearly as much as the simple, quiet truth settling between the Alpha King and the woman his gift could never fully reach, a truth built not on magic or inherited power, but on choice, courage, and a trust earned freely, one honest moment at a time.